Hi there. Let me take a few minutes to discuss my take on the first of the AP practice questions that I gave you. Good example of why you want to read the entire scenario first and then read both of the questions that you need to answer, part A and B, before you start to write. In part A, you only need to list the assumptions that are necessary for the confidence interval to be appropriate. You don't have to say yet whether you think they're actually satisfied. That's your job in part B, to discuss whether each of the assumptions in part A appears to be satisfied or not. So part A, the answers are more generic, whereas in part B, you're going to be specific about each of your answers. So number one, the sample should be from an SRS of the adults who use the cave. Understand, that's the population. We're trying to build a confidence interval for the average or the true population mean foot length from the population of the adults who use the cave dwelling. So we need an SRS of the adults. We should know that that population of adults who use the cave is more than 10 times the sample size. That's the independence condition. And then lastly, we need to believe that X bar, the sample means, are approximately normally distributed. So you don't have to get into too much detail here. Of course, a large sample would be nice. 30 or more, we could use the central limit theorem. If we're under 30, then we're going to have to look at the values that we have in our actual sample. Of course, it would also be okay to know that the population's foot length itself is normally distributed. That would automatically say that X bar is normal. That's not something that we know, so we're going to have to end up looking at our sample. But that's not something we have to worry about until part B. So in part B, let's discuss the first assumption, the SRS assumption. Believe it or not, and I think this is tricky, it is not satisfied. Even though the original question, and if you go look at it, it specifically says that the researchers have randomly selected 20 of the footprints from the population of all footprints in the cave. The problem is they randomly selected from the population of footprints. They did not randomly select from the population of adults who used the cave dwelling. So the problem here is the SRS assumption is not satisfied. What was randomly chosen were the footprints. The adults should have been randomly chosen and then had their footprints measured, had their feet measured, which of course that's not possible. So the independence assumption, there are two possibilities. Either answer is okay as long as you justify it correctly. So notice the question states that there are a large number of footprints. If you go back up here, it says that the dwelling contains a large number of adult human footprints. So if you believe that large number is more than 200, then you can say that the population size is greater than or equal to 10 times the sample, and you're good to go. Of course, anecdotally, you might be able to tell a story to claim that independence is not satisfied. Here's a good example of why. What if the same adult left many of the footprints among the many that are in the cave? Well, the problem is when we randomly select 20, that same length could end up in the sample multiple times because we're choosing a footprint that might have come from the same adult. That would violate the fact that, or the requirement that the observations, the actual footprints selected for the sample are all independent from one another. In fact, maybe some of them came from the same adult. So satisfied or not satisfied, depending on the way you want to spin it, and either answer is correct. Same thing regarding the normality assumption, the necessary requirement that X bar is distributed approximately normally. Something to think about. You could actually create a box and whisker plot. That's why this information was given to you. The minimum, the first quartile, the median, the third quartile, and the maximum. So you could use those in order to create a simple box and whisker plot. Here's the minimum, Q1, the median, Q3, and the maximum. So if you want to interpret that, there are a couple of ways you could interpret it. You could say the normality condition is satisfied because with a sample size of 20, there aren't any outliers. I actually built the criteria for outliers. 1.5 IQRs would be 16.95. And if you subtract that from Q1, you have 1.75. If you add it to Q3, you have 46.95. So there are no observations below this 1.75 or above the 46.95 because I know that the minimum and I know that the maximum don't exceed those values. So there are no outliers, and there's only maybe slight skewness, so you could say that X bar should be distributed approximately normally. Of course, if you think that skewness is severe, then you could say the condition isn't satisfied. Even though there aren't any outliers, the data looks strongly skewed, so it's not reasonable to say that X bar is distributed normally. a matter of opinion.